In the summer of 1944, in a small cafe on the main street of Hearne, Texas, a German prisoner of war sat down at a table, ordered a Coca-Cola and a slice of pie, and was served without a question. Outside on the sidewalk, in the 90-degree heat, an American soldier in the uniform of the United States Army stood and waited for the enemy to finish his meal, because the American soldier was black, and the cafe would not serve him. This is a true story. It happened in this country, on our own soil, while our fathers and uncles were dying in Europe and the Pacific. It happened in more than 70 prisoner of war camps in the state of Texas alone, and in hundreds more from Louisiana to the Dakotas to the deserts of Arizona. More than 425,000 German prisoners were held on American land during the Second World War. Most Americans alive today have never been told about them. This is the story of one of those men. His name was Heino Eriksson. He was 18 years old when he was captured. He was 22 when he came home. And the country that held him for those 4 years was not the country he had been raised to hate. It was something stranger, something harder, and in the end, something more human than the enemy the radios of Berlin had ever promised him. The train pulled into the depot at Hearne, Texas, on a hot July morning in 1943. The men waiting on the platform were cattlemen, farmers, cotton growers with skin the color of saddle leather and hands the color of the earth they worked. They had come from 20 miles in every direction, some of them driving trucks that had been coughing through the war, years on retreaded tires and rationed gasoline. They had come because the United States Army had sent word that a new kind of labor was arriving in Robertson County. They had come to see the enemy. For 2 years, the newsreels in the picture houses of Bryan and Waco and Houston had shown them what the enemy looked like. Tall, blonde, stone-jawed men in coal scuttle helmets. Stormtroopers goose-stepping down the Champs-Élysées. Panzer crews grinning from the turrets of their machines as they rolled across the steppes of Russia. The enemy was a Superman. The enemy was a giant. The enemy had been building itself for a decade, in torchlight and iron and disciplined shouting, into a thing the world had not seen before. And now the enemy was coming to Texas on a train. The doors of the cars slid open. American guards climbed down first, rifles slung, boots hitting the boards of the platform with the flat sound of tired men doing tired work. Then, one at a time, the prisoners began to appear in the doorways. The cattlemen stopped talking. The men who stepped down onto the platform were not giants. They were not Supermen. They were thin. They were sunburned. Their uniforms hung on them the way wet laundry hangs on a wire. Some of them had to hold their trousers up with their hands because the belts had been taken away for the journey. Their heads had been shaved for lice. Their eyes had the flat, animal patience of men who had stopped expecting anything from the next hour of their lives. Near the middle of the second car, a boy stepped down. He was 18 years old. His name was Heino Eriksson. He had lost more than 30 pounds in the last 6 months. He weighed that morning on the platform in Hearne about 120 pounds. He was tall enough that the weight loss made him look elongated, spidery, as if someone had drawn him with a pencil and then dragged an eraser down the length of him. A cattleman at the front of the crowd, a man in his 50s, in a straw Stetson, gone yellow at the sweatband, looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he turned to the man standing next to him, and he said one thing, in the flat, quiet voice of a man who is looking at something he had not expected to see. "Well, hell," he said, "that ain't no Nazi. That's a child." To understand how a starving boy from the North German coast ended up on a railway platform in central Texas that morning, we have to go back to the second week of May in 1943 to a piece of ground on the coast of North Africa that in the last week of its usefulness to the German war effort earned itself a nickname among the men who died on it. They called it Tunisgrad, after the other place. After the city on the Volga where an entire German army had already vanished into the snow 3 months earlier. The comparison was not a joke. By the morning of May 12, 1943, what remained of the German and Italian forces in North Africa had been pressed into a small pocket at the northeastern tip of the continent, around the port of Tunis and the smaller port of Bizerte. Their backs were to the Mediterranean. The British Eighth Army was closing on them from the south. The American Second Corps, under General Omar Bradley, was closing on them from the west. The Luftwaffe had not appeared over their positions in weeks. The last supply convoys from Sicily had been sunk in the sea. Rommel, the man they had followed across 3 countries and 2 years, was already gone, flown out in March, officially for medical reasons, and Hitler had refused to let him come back. They were out of water. They were out of ammunition. They were out of hope. In a shallow gun pit dug into the yellow earth, an 18-year-old private named Heino Eriksson sat with his back against the sandbags and tried not to think about his tongue. His tongue felt like leather. His lips had cracked open days ago, and the salt of his own dried sweat found the openings every time he moved his mouth. He had been in North Africa for 4 months. He had been a soldier for 2 years. He had joined, like every boy of his generation, in the small towns of Schleswig-Holstein, because there had been no way not to join. He had been a member of the Hitler Youth before that, and the Jungvolk before that, and the world he had grown up in had one shape and one direction and one voice, and it was Adolf Hitler's. He had believed all of it once, the way a child believes. He was not sure, that morning in the gun pit, what he believed anymore. The order to surrender came down the line in a whisper. It was not shouted. There were no bugles. Nobody wept. The men in the pit stood up, one at a time, and they walked out into the open with their hands on their heads, and behind them, in a farmhouse whose walls still smelled of cordite and diesel, a German general was signing the piece of paper that would send more than 275,000 men into captivity. It was, at that moment, the largest mass surrender the Western Allies had ever received. Heino remembered, for the rest of his life, that the first American he saw was chewing gum. The soldier was young, perhaps his own age. He had a helmet pushed back on a sunburned forehead, and a rifle held loosely across his chest, and he looked at Heino the way a man might look at a stray dog that had wandered into his yard. Not with hatred, not with mercy, with a tired kind of curiosity. Then he pointed with his chin toward a line of prisoners already forming on the road, and he said one word. Go! Heino went. At a collection point outside a town whose name he never learned, an American mess sergeant walked down the line of prisoners with a wooden crate. He was a heavy man, with dark stains under the arms of his shirt. He was not smiling. He was handing out small brown cardboard boxes, one to each prisoner, moving down the line with the mechanical steadiness of a man who had done this many times already that day. Heino took the box. It was warm from the sun. He opened it. And inside that box was more food than Heino Eriksson had held in his hands in 6 weeks. A tin of meat, biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a block of chocolate, powdered drink mix, cigarettes, chewing gum. A tiny key to open the tin, taped neatly to the side of the can. For a long moment, he did not eat. He held the box in his hands, and something inside his chest came loose. Something he had been holding tight for many months without knowing he was holding it. And what came into that empty place was not gratitude. It was not even relief. Fear. Because Heino Eriksson had been told, since he was a boy, what waited on the other side of surrender. The radios of Berlin had described it in careful, patient language. The Americans took no prisoners, or they took prisoners only to work them to death in mines somewhere out beyond the maps. Fall into their hands, the broadcast had warned, and you will vanish. Your mother will never know where your bones are buried. He looked at the food in his hands. And in the quiet of a Tunisian afternoon, a boy who had believed a lie for 18 years began, for the first time, to suspect that he had been lied to. The ship that came for them at Oran was a converted transport, gray and blunt and utterly without beauty. They marched the prisoners up the gangway in long columns and sent them down into the hold. The air below decks was thick with the smell of oil and vomit and the sour breath of hundreds of men who had not bathed in days. The bunks were stacked 4 high. Somewhere above them, the great engines began to turn. The voyage took nearly 3 weeks. For most of that time, Haino lay in his bunk and listened. He listened to the water sliding along the steel hull a few centimeters from his ear. He listened to the men around him, praying in the dark. And he listened, above all, for the sound he had been trained to fear more than any other. The distant metallic thud of a torpedo striking home. German submarines were still hunting in the Atlantic in the summer of 1943. It was one of the strange cruelties of that war that a captured German soldier on an American ship might be killed by a German torpedo, fired by German men who did not know he was there. Haino thought about it in the dark. He thought about the letter his mother would receive. Missing at sea, cause unknown, but the torpedo never came. What came instead, twice a day, was food, real food. White bread so soft it seemed almost fake to men who had grown up on the dark, dense loaves of Central Europe, stew with actual meat in it, coffee in tin cups that were never empty for long. A young clerk from Dresden, lying in the bunk above Haino, whispered down one night in a voice that was almost angry. "If this is what they feed their prisoners," he said, "what do you think they feed their soldiers?" Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. It was on one of the brief permissions to come up on deck, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, that Haino Eriksson saw the thing that finished work the food had started. The convoy stretched to the horizon, not the near horizon, every horizon. Cargo vessels, tankers, escort destroyers, cutting white lines through the blue water. He counted the ships till he lost count, and this was one convoy, in 1 week, in one summer of a war that had 4 summers in it. He stood at the rail with the wind pulling at his thin uniform, and he understood, in a way no propaganda broadcast could ever have undone, that the war was lost. Not lost in some distant theoretical sense. Lost the way a chess game is lost when there are no pieces left on your side of the board. He did not say any of it out loud. It would have been dangerous. There were still men on that ship who believed. There were still men who would have reported him. But he thought it. And once he thought it, it could not be unthought. They reached the harbor of New York in the last days of June. Haino Eriksson stood at the rail as the ship moved slowly past the Statue of Liberty, and he understood, without needing anyone to tell him, exactly where he was. The heat that rose off the American docks was different from African heat. It was wet. It clung to the skin like a damp cloth. A long train waited on a siding. Dull green cars with United States Army stenciled along the sides. Haino Eriksson climbed aboard and took a seat by a window. And for the next 4 days and nights, he watched America roll past that window. And each hour of it took another brick out of the wall of everything he had been raised to believe. The train moved west across a country that could not be believed. In the small towns of Virginia and Tennessee and Arkansas, the lights burned all night, whole grids of them, shining across dark rivers, unshielded, unblacked out, as if the war on the other side of the ocean were only a rumor somebody had heard once and half forgotten. In the shop windows of these towns, there were canned goods stacked in pyramids, dresses on wire forms, radios and toasters and shoes, rows of shoes, new shoes, in leather, in colors. Haino Eriksson pressed his forehead against the glass and stared. In the rail yards of Memphis, on a siding half a mile long, he saw new Sherman tanks on flat cars, still glossy with the paint they had come out of the factory wearing. All of them pointed east. In the switching yards of Little Rock, he saw new artillery pieces, dozens of them, waiting for the ships that would carry them across the ocean he had just crossed the other way. His mother in Germany was, at that same hour, standing in a line for 2 hours to receive her weekly ration of bread. He did not know that, but he knew the shape of it. He had left her 4 months earlier in a Germany that had been at war for years, and that was already visibly poorer than the Germany he had been born into. The The train crossed the Sabine River in the middle of a night. When Haino woke, the sky outside the window had changed. It was bigger. It went on forever. The land under it was flat and yellow and dotted with cattle. Windmills turned slowly at the edges of small farms. This was Texas. The town of Hearne, when they reached it, was almost nothing. A scattering of low buildings baking in the sun, a grain elevator, a water tower with the town's name painted down the side in letters that had faded in the weather. It was the kind of place a train passed through on the way somewhere else. But the camp, 3 miles outside the town, was another matter entirely. Camp Hearne rose out of the flat cotton country the way a small city rises out of a plain. It covered 720 acres. 6 months earlier, this land had been in cotton and pasture. Now, row after row of white wooden barracks stretched away in disciplined lines, so orderly and so numerous that a man standing at one end of the compound could not see the barracks at the other end. A water tower painted silver stood at the center. Guard towers rose at every corner of the double perimeter fence, their searchlights already mounted for the coming night. There were mess halls, workshops, an infirmary. There was a small outdoor theater with wooden benches arranged in front of a raised stage. Camp had been built to hold 4,800 prisoners of war. It was one of nearly 70 such camps that the United States would ultimately construct in the state of Texas alone. Across the whole of the country, by the time the war ended, more than 700 camps would be scattered from the pine forests of Louisiana to the wheat fields of the Dakotas to the desert flats of Arizona. And behind those fences, at the peak of the program, would be held more than 425,000 German prisoners of war. Texas would hold more of them than any other state. The prisoners who were coming off the trains that summer of 1943 were mostly veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps. They were the men the Allies had scooped up in the Great Collapse at Tunis and Bizerte. They came with their tan uniforms bleached almost white by the North African sun. They came with the swagger, some of them, of men who had been told for 2 years that they were the best soldiers in the world. They came with, in a number of cases, the members of Rommel's own military orchestra, who would spend the next 3 years playing Beethoven and Wagner on borrowed instruments in a mess hall in central Texas. Roughly 3/4 of the prisoners at Camp Hearne were non-commissioned officers. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, non-commissioned officers could not be compelled to work. Only the enlisted men, about 1 in 5, would go out into the fields. Haino Erickson was one of the enlisted men. He climbed down from the train onto the dust of the camp's receiving yard. An American officer read from a clipboard in a voice that was bored and precise. A German-speaking sergeant translated the rules in a flat monotone. Roll call at dawn. Roll call at dusk. No fraternization with civilians. Escape would be punished. Cooperation would be rewarded. And then, almost as an afterthought, the sergeant added the sentence that would define the next 2 years of Haino Erickson's life. You will be paid for your labor. 10 cents per hour in canteen script. You will work in the fields. The land Haino Erickson was going to work was the Blackland Prairie of central Texas. It was one of the great cotton regions of the American South. The soil was heavy and dark, and in summer, in the long afternoons of July and August, the temperature climbed to 100 degrees and held there. The heat did not come off the ground the way desert heat came off the ground. It sat on you. It got into your lungs. Men who had grown up in the cool, damp valleys of Schleswig-Holstein or the Bavarian foothills would walk into a Texas cotton field in mid-August and think, in the first hour, that they had been sent to hell. The land was flat. It was empty. It went on for miles in every direction with no trees and no rivers and no hills. If a man wanted to escape from Camp Hearne, there was, in a strict geographical sense, nowhere to escape to. The nearest large town was Bryan, 20 miles south. The nearest coast was more than 150 miles east. The Rio Grande was 700 miles to the southwest, across country so open that a European in a torn Wehrmacht shirt would have been visible from an airplane at 10,000 feet. Very few men tried. Across the entire American prisoner of war system, from 1,942 to 1,946, across all 700 camps in 46 states, the escape rate of German prisoners was less than 1%. And almost every man who escaped was recaptured within days, usually within a few miles of the camp he had left, often because he turned himself in when he got hungry. The locals had a nickname for Camp Hearn. They called it the Fritz Ritz. They meant it at first as a complaint. The Ritz because the prisoners inside seemed to eat too well. The prisoners inside were housed too well. Prisoners inside had a swimming pool they had dug themselves, and a theater with a stage, and a library stocked with German books that the American Red Cross had shipped in by the crate. The prisoners inside had a soccer field and an orchestra and their own newspaper. And out beyond the wire, in the small farms of Robertson County, the sons of the men who lived on those farms were being killed in North Africa and Sicily and, before the year was out, on the beaches of Salerno. There was a bitterness in the nickname. There was going to be more bitterness before the war ended. But the Fritz Ritz was not, on the whole, an inaccurate description. The camp was, by the standards of any prisoner of war facility anywhere else in the world in that decade, remarkably decent. There was a reason for that. Two reasons, actually. The first was the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified. Under Article 11 of that convention, prisoners of war were to be fed at a level equivalent to the base garrison troops of the detaining power. The American garrison troops of Camp Hearn received about 3,400 calories a day. So did the prisoners. Second was Germany. Germany was still holding, in 1,943, tens of thousands of American prisoners of war. The American government understood, in a very practical way, that how it treated German prisoners in Texas would shape how the German government treated American prisoners in Bavaria. The Fritz Ritz was, among other things, an insurance policy on the lives of American boys in stalags on the other side of the world. The farmers of Robertson County did not know any of this. They only knew that they needed labor. The war had emptied the American countryside of its young men. By the summer of 1943, more than 1 million men from Texas alone were in uniform, scattered across half the world. The cotton fields that had employed them stood full and ready for harvest, with almost no one left to pick them. The State Agricultural Extension Office had been warning, in its quiet, bureaucratic way, that without new labor, a significant fraction of the year's crop would rot in the fields. Rot, in the calculus of a war economy, meant shortages. Less cotton for uniforms, less food for cities, less of everything a country at war needed to keep the machine running. The prisoners of Camp Hearn, in a very real sense, were the reason certain Texas farms did not go under in those years. And on the second day, Heino Eriksson ever worked in an American cotton field on a farm about 6 miles from the camp, something happened that he would remember for the rest of his life. The farmer, a lean man in his 50s in a stained work shirt, walked down the row at mid-morning carrying a large tin jug of cold water and a stack of paper cups. This was not part of the arrangement. Heino and the other prisoners had their own canteens, filled at the farmhouse pump before dawn. The farmer was not required to give them anything more than shade at noon and a ride back to the camp gate at dusk. But the farmer walked down the row and he poured a cup of water for every prisoner in it. And when he reached Heino, he paused. He looked at him for a long second, and then he spoke to him in German. "Where kommst du, Junge? Where are you from, boy?" The German was heavy with a strange accent. The vowels flattened, the consonants softened, like a language that had been carried a long way from home and had picked up dust along the road. But it was German. Heino was so surprised he could not answer. "Schleswig-Holstein," he finally said. "In the north." The farmer nodded slowly. My grandfather, he said, came from Fredericksburg. His father came from Württemberg in 1854. He never went back. Then he handed Heino the cup of water and walked on to the next prisoner. Heino Eriksson drank the water. It was cold, it tasted of the well and of the tin of the jug. He watched the farmer's back as it moved slowly down the row. A man in his 50s in a stained work shirt, pouring water for the enemies of his country, because 3 generations back, his own blood had crossed an ocean and settled this flat land and forgotten almost everything except the language of a village in Württemberg. In the middle of the 19th century, tens of thousands of Germans crossed the Atlantic and settled in a stretch of the Texas Hill Country between the Colorado River and the Guadalupe. They founded towns and gave them names from home: Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, Boern, Comfort. They built stone farmhouses that still stand today. They kept their language, their Lutheran churches, their beer gardens, their sausages. Well into the 20th century, there were Texas counties where you could walk into a general store and hear German spoken across the counter as naturally as English. The First World War had done real damage to that culture. In 1917 and 1918, German Texans had been pressured to abandon their language, to close their newspapers, to anglicize their family names. Some had not. And when the Second World War came and prisoners of war began to arrive in the Texas camps, there were still farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers scattered across the hill country and the cotton belt who could speak to those prisoners in the language their grandparents had brought across the ocean. It changed things. It did not change everything. There were still guards. There were still fences. There were still rules against fraternization, and those rules were sometimes enforced with real seriousness. But when a Texas farmer handed a cup of cold water to a starving 18-year-old German boy in a cotton field in the summer of 1943, and when he asked that boy where he was from, and when the boy answered in the same language the farmer's grandfather had spoken 60 years earlier, something happened that no regulation could quite reach. 2 men recognized each other, and that recognition, small and quiet and unofficial, was the beginning of the strangest chapter in Heino Eriksson's life. But it was not, as he was about to learn, the whole story of Camp Hearn. Because inside the wire, behind the barracks, and beneath the well-fed calm and the string quartets and the football games, another war was being fought. A war the American guards could not see. A war that was about to kill a young man from New York. The first cotton row Heino Eriksson ever picked was longer than any road he had ever walked in his life. It began at a fence post on a farm in Robertson County. It ended at a line of trees so distant that in the shimmering August heat, the trees seemed to float above the ground rather than grow out of it. Between the fence post and the trees lay 800 yards of white bowls hanging in the sun. And the farmer standing at the head of the row had told him through the interpreter that he was expected to pick 100 pounds of that cotton before sundown. Heino Eriksson looked at his own hands. They were the hands of a boy just turned 19. Hands that had loaded artillery shells and held a rifle. They were not the hands of a cotton picker. He had never in his life bent his back to a plant that grew low to the ground. He had never dragged a long canvas sack behind him through a field. He had never felt what the cotton bolls would do to his fingers by the second hour of a Texas afternoon, when the sharp, dry husks around each white puff of fiber would open small cuts along the sides of his thumbs, and the salt of his own sweat would find those cuts and turn them into a slow, whispering pain that would not stop until dark. He learned all of it in a single day. By noon, his back felt as though someone had driven a nail into the base of his spine. By 2 o'clock, his fingers were bleeding into the canvas of the sack. By 4, he had picked 43 pounds. The farmer walked down the row, looked into the sack, and shook his head. Not with anger, not with sympathy, with the tired practicality of a man who had raised cotton for 30 years. "You need to eat more," the interpreter told Heino. Heino almost laughed. He had eaten, that morning, a breakfast larger than any breakfast his mother had put on the table since 1940. 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, a stack of pancakes with syrup, coffee with real cream. And still, by 4 o'clock in a Texas cotton field, his body had used all of it up and was asking for more. The United States was, at that moment, feeding its German prisoners better than most Germans were being fed at home. Across the ocean, in the cities of the Reich, an ordinary German civilian in 1,943 was surviving on somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calories a day. And by the winter of 1944, that number would collapse further in the ruined towns where the bombers had done their work. In Berlin, in Hamburg, in Dresden. The mothers and sisters of the men at Camp Hearn were standing in lines for hours to receive an allocation of bread that would have looked pitiful on the trays of the American mess halls. Heino Eriksson's body adjusted. By the second week, he was picking 80 pounds a day. By the third, 100. His hands developed the calluses that every cotton picker eventually grows. Thick pads of skin along the edges of the fingers that dulled the bite of the husks. His back still hurt. It would hurt in the low, steady way that agricultural labor leaves its signature on a man for the rest of his life. But he could do the work now. And at the end of each day, when the American guard walked down the line of prisoners with a clipboard and marked down the pounds each man had picked, Heino Eriksson received his 80 cents of canteen script, a small paper voucher he could spend at the camp store on cigarettes or chocolate or writing paper, or, if he saved for a few weeks, a used novel from the shelf of German language books the Red Cross kept stocked in the camp library. The American farmers of Robertson County paid the United States government roughly the prevailing local wage for a laborer. The government kept most of it. The prisoner got the script. Nobody in Robertson County was going to complain about the arrangement. The cotton was coming in. But the story was not going to stay quiet. In the last months of the war, when American newspapers began to publish what the government had been feeding the German prisoners in the camps, a bitterness would rise in this country that shocked the men who had built the program. There would be editorials. There would be angry letters to congressmen. There would be quiet, furious meetings in small towns where a Gold Star mother had received a telegram about her son in the Ardennes and then read in the county paper that a German prisoner in a camp not 30 war was eating steak on Sunday. They would call it the coddling controversy, and it would leave a mark. But that was still 18 months away. In the summer of 1943, in a cotton field in Robertson County, Heino Eriksson was simply a hungry boy learning a new kind of work, and the war was still on, and the strangest thing that had happened to him so far was a cup of cold water. The strangest thing he was about to see was going to happen in a cafe. On a Saturday afternoon in the late summer of 1943, 4 prisoners from Camp Hearn, Heino among them, were taken into the town of Hearn to make purchases at the local shops. It was an arrangement the camp commander permitted on occasion for prisoners with good work records. They rode in the back of a truck with an American guard sitting on the tailgate, rifle across his knees. The guard was a young man from Louisiana, 20 years old. His name in this story will be Marcus, because his real name was not written down. Marcus was black. He belonged to one of the segregatedist service units that the United States Army of that era assigned to support and labor duties. He wore the uniform of the United States Army. He carried a rifle issued by the United States government. He was, in the strictest legal and military sense, a soldier of the country that had captured the 4 Germans sitting in the truck with him. The truck stopped on the main street of Hearn. The prisoners climbed down. They went into a small cafe. They sat at a table. A waitress brought them menus, printed on cardboard, greasy at the corners. They ordered sandwiches. They ordered Coca-Colas. They ordered slices of pie. The waitress smiled at them. The other customers in the cafe, ordinary Texans in ordinary work clothes, glanced over and went back to their own conversations. Nobody objected. Nobody stared for long. The German prisoners were served their food. They ate it. They paid with canteen script that the cafe was willing to accept. They walked back out into the sun. Sidewalk, standing in the 90-degree heat next to the truck that would carry them back to the camp, was Marcus, the young American soldier from Louisiana, 20 years old, in the uniform of the United States Army. He had not been permitted to enter that cafe. He had not been permitted to sit at that counter. He had not been permitted to order that sandwich or that Coca-Cola or that slice of pie. He had stood on the sidewalk in the Texas heat, and he had waited for the enemy to finish his meal. Hino Erickson climbed into the back of the truck, and for a long moment, before the truck pulled away, he stood on the tailgate and he looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked back at him. Neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing in any of the languages either of them spoke that was equal to the moment. That night, in his barracks, Hino Erickson lay in his bunk and tried to fit what he had seen into any framework that made sense to him. The Nazi propaganda he had absorbed since he was a child had told him that America was a mongrel country, a place where the races mixed and the culture rotted from the mixing. What he had seen that afternoon was not mixing. It was the opposite of mixing. It was a wall, invisible, but absolute, running through the town of Hearne, and, he would come to understand, through the entire American South. And on one side of that wall stood a German enemy in a captured uniform, drinking Coca-Cola at a table. And on the other side stood an American soldier in his country's own uniform, forbidden to sit down. Hino Erickson wrote about that afternoon many decades later in an old man's memoir published in Texas in 2001. He wrote that it was the moment he first began to understand that the country holding him prisoner was a country at war with itself as much as it was at war with Germany. He wrote that he did not know what to do with that understanding. He wrote that he carried it with him for the rest of his life. And then, in the autumn of 1943, a man named Hugo Kraus came into full view in the yards of Camp Hearne. Corporal Hugo Kraus was 24 years old. He was sharp-featured, quick-witted, and he spoke English with the flat, easy vowels of the New York streets where he had grown up. He had been born in Germany, but his family had emigrated to the United States when he was 9 years old. He had spent his boyhood in the German neighborhoods of New York City. He had gone to American schools. He had eaten American food. He had known baseball and the elevated trains and the smell of an American summer. In 1939, his family had made the decision to return to Germany. It was a decision that thousands of German-American families made in the 1930s. Some for economic reasons, some out of misplaced enthusiasm for the new regime in Berlin, some simply because they had never really put down roots in America. The Kraus family went back. And when the war came, Hugo, like every other young German man of his generation, was drafted into the Wehrmacht. He served on the Eastern Front. He saw things there he did not talk about afterward. Then he was transferred to North Africa, and he was captured in the same great collapse that had sent Hino Erickson across the Atlantic. And now, in the autumn of 1943, he was in Camp Hearne. Because he spoke perfect American English, he was almost immediately useful. The American guards liked him. He translated for them. He joked with them. He drank coffee in their offices when the shifts changed. He carried messages between the commandant's office and the prisoner compounds. He laughed at American jokes because he understood them the way a native speaker understands jokes. For all of this, in the world of Camp Hearne, he began almost immediately to be marked. Every prisoner of war camp in the United States had within its wire a hidden second government. The American administration ran the camp on paper, roll call, rations, work details, discipline, But inside the barracks, especially in the barracks that held enlisted men and non-commissioned officers from combat units, there was another authority, and it belonged to the men who still believed. The men for whom the Nazi Party had not disappeared when the Afrika Korps surrendered. It had simply moved indoors. In many camps, hardcore Nazi non-commissioned officers organized themselves into unofficial disciplinary committees. They kept lists. They watched who talked to the Americans too easily. They watched who accepted small favors from the guards. They watched who expressed doubt in unguarded conversation about the final victory of the Reich. At Camp Herne, they published a secret newsletter. They called it Die Mahnung, the admonition. They circulated it hand to hand in the barracks. They ran secret disciplinary hearings. They infiltrated the central post office of the American Prisoner of War System, which was headquartered at Camp Herne, and they used it to track disloyal prisoners across the country. They kept hidden shortwave radios beneath the floorboards of the barracks, and they listened to Berlin every night. They kept lists, and Hugo Kraus was on those lists. The enforcement of discipline usually began with warnings, a quiet word in a barracks, a cold shoulder in the mess line, a note pinned to a bunk. If the warnings were ignored, the enforcement escalated, beatings in the latrines, threats against family members whose addresses were still in Germany, still reachable by the mail. And in a small number of cases, in camps scattered across the United States during those years, the enforcement went further. Werner Drexler was murdered at Papago Park, Arizona, in March of 1944 by his own countrymen who believed he had informed for the Americans. Johannes Kunze was beaten to death at Camp Tonkawa in November of 1943 on the same suspicion. By the end of the war, 14 German prisoners would be hanged by the United States government at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for the murders of fellow prisoners inside American camps. 7 of them on the 10th of July, 1945, for the killing of Johannes Kunze at Camp Tonkawa. 7 more on the 25th of August, 1945, for the killing of Werner Drexler at Papago Park. 14 men hanged in a single summer for killings that had taken place not on some distant battlefield, but in the barracks of the country that had captured them. Hugo Kraus's killers would not be among those 14. They would face a different fate. But the pattern that was tightening around him the autumn of 1943 was the same pattern. Heino Eriksson had been transferred by then into a work detail that put him in occasional contact with Kraus. He liked the older man. Kraus was easy company. He told stories about Coney Island and about the elevated trains that ran through New York City and about the smell of an American summer. He told them in a German that was full of English words dropped in without warning, the way an immigrant's speech is always full of the other language. Heino did not know, on the December afternoon when he last saw Kraus walking across the camp yard with a stack of papers under his arm, that he was seeing a dead man. The night of December 17, 1943, was cold in central Texas. A wind was coming down out of the north, the kind of wind that Texans call a norther. The temperature in the barracks was dropping fast enough that men were pulling their blankets up around their shoulders and turning their faces toward the wall. In Compound A, Hugo Kraus was in his bunk. Men came for him. They came, according to the testimony that would later be gathered by American investigators in the darkness of the barracks. They came, 6 to 10 of them, with the tacit knowledge of others in the room. Others who saw and understood what was happening and who chose, out of fear or agreement or some mixture of the two, to say nothing and to do nothing. They pulled Hugo Kraus from his bunk. They beat him. They beat him with clubs. They beat him with boards that had been studded with nails. One of them, according to the investigation, used a length of lead pipe. They beat his face. They beat his ribs. They beat his skull. By the time the American guards were alerted, and by the time a medical officer reached the barracks in the freezing early hours of the next morning, Hugo Kraus was still breathing. But he would never wake up as the man he had been. He was rushed to a hospital. He lingered for a few days, unconscious, his body carrying on a fight his mind had already lost. He died shortly after from the injuries he had received on the night of December 17, 1943, without ever having recovered enough to name his attackers or to answer for the crime of speaking English too well. Heino Eriksson was not in Compound A the night Kraus was attacked. He was sleeping nearby. He did not hear the sounds it made, but he heard, the next morning, what had happened. Everyone in the camp heard. The news moved through the barracks the way bad news always moves in an enclosed community. Quickly, quietly, without needing to be spoken aloud. A man was dying. A man had been struck down by other men in the same uniform. And the American guards who had walked their rounds through the night and noticed nothing until it was too late were now moving through the camp with a different kind of attention in their eyes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation moved into Camp Hearn in the days that followed. The killing of a prisoner of war on American soil was a federal matter of the gravest kind. Agents in dark suits walked the same dust between the barracks where the prisoners walked. They interviewed men one at a time in small rooms through interpreters. They wrote down names. They wrote down movements. They wrote down the small, careful phrases men use when they are trying to describe a killing without admitting that they knew it was going to happen. It took months. It took, in the end, more than a year. 5 prisoners were eventually identified as the men responsible for the attack in Compound A. They were tried by a United States military tribunal. They were convicted. They were sentenced to life imprisonment. One of them, a young man named Günther Meisel, would confess before the camp closed in 1946. He said he was sorry. He said he could not carry it any longer. The 5 men convicted of the Kraus killing were not, in the end, hanged at Fort Leavenworth. In 1949, 4 years after the war ended, they were granted clemency by the American government. They were released. They were sent home to Germany. But Hugo Kraus did not go home. He was 24 years old. Heino Eriksson sat on the edge of his bunk on the morning of December 18, 1943, and he understood, in a way he had not understood before, that the war he was living inside of was not the war he had been sent to fight. The war he had been sent to fight was against the Americans, out there on the other side of the wire. The war that was actually being fought in the winter of 1943 in a barracks in Central Texas was against a young man from New York who had made the mistake of speaking English too well. Heino Eriksson understood, as he sat there in the cold morning light, that he was going to have to decide, at some point in the months ahead, which of those 2 wars he was going to be a soldier in. He did not know yet what he was going to decide. But the winter was long, and the answer was coming. In the months that followed the death of Hugo Kraus, the American authorities did something they had been slow to do before. They began, quietly and with real determination, to separate the hardcore Nazis from the general population of the camps. Camp Alva in Oklahoma became the best known of these facilities, a camp where the true believers were sent to live among their own kind, isolated from the ordinary prisoners they had been terrorizing. And once they were gone, the atmosphere inside the ordinary camps began, slowly and unevenly, to change. Men who had kept quiet for years began in low, careful voices to speak. Into that opening space, the United States War Department introduced something it had been preparing in secret for more than a year. It was called, in the bland language of the bureaucracy, the Special Projects Division. Its purpose was almost impossibly ambitious. It was going to try to change what several 100,000 German prisoners of war believed about the world before those prisoners went home. The program was hidden, even from most of the American guards. It was run out of a small office in Washington by a group of officers and civilian intellectuals who had studied German culture and German history and German literature. They understood that direct propaganda would not work. Men who had been raised on propaganda knew propaganda when they saw it. What might work, they believed, was something quieter. A German-language newspaper written and edited by carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners themselves. Books. Hundreds of thousands of books in German, chosen to reintroduce the prisoners to the tradition of German thought that had existed before the Reich, and that would need to exist again after it. Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, books the Nazis had banned, books the Nazis had burned, films, lectures, small classes in American civics and democratic theory and the history of the Weimar Republic and the mistakes that had killed it. The newspaper was called Der Ruf, the call. It appeared in the camps in the spring of 1945, printed on cheap paper, distributed alongside the mail. It was written in a German that was serious and literary and quietly intelligent. It did not lecture the prisoners about the evil of National Socialism. It simply printed articles about American history, about German writers the Nazis had banned, about the world as it was actually going to look after the war ended. Heino Erikson read every issue. He read them in his bunk in the evenings. After the work in the fields was finished, and the mess hall had been cleared, and the barracks had settled into the low murmur that came before lights out. He was 20 years old now. He had been a prisoner for almost 2 years. Der Ruf did not tell him what to think. It simply gave him things to think about. That perhaps was its whole genius. And then in the spring of 1945, in a mess hall at Camp Hearn, the American authorities brought a film projector into the room and lowered the lights and started the reel. The footage they showed had been shot by American and British and Soviet camera crews as they walked into the concentration camps of Germany and Poland in the last weeks of the war. Buchen, Wald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Mauthausen. It had been assembled by the United States Army Signal Corps into a series of films that would be used later that year as evidence at Nuremberg. A longer version, called Die Todesmühlen, the Mills of Death, would be cut together in part by an Austrian-born director named Billy Wilder, who had lost members of his own family in the camps, and released to German civilians in early 1946. But the prisoners in the American camps saw the raw material first. The prisoners were assembled. The lights went down. The projector began to whir. And onto the screen, in front of several 100,000 German men in American captivity, flickered the images. The bodies stacked like cordwood along the wire. The living skeletons in the striped uniforms staring at the camera without expression. The ovens, the pits, the children. There was silence in the mess halls. Heino Erikson sat in one of those rooms and watched the film and did not move. Around him, other men were also not moving. Some were weeping quietly. Some had covered their faces with their hands. Some were staring at the screen with a fixed, glassy attention, as if by concentrating hard enough, they could turn the images into something else, something they could deny, something they could push away. The first reaction in the days that followed was disbelief. The men said the films must be fake, that the Americans had staged them, that the piles of bodies were actors playing dead, that the ovens were props, that the whole thing was a piece of Victor's propaganda designed to break the German spirit. Heino Erikson wrote in his memoir, decades later, that he wanted to believe that too. He wrote that he wanted, with everything in him, to believe that the country he had served, the country his father had served in the First World War, the country his mother still lived in, the country whose language was the language of his childhood and his prayers and his mother's kitchen, had not done the thing the film said it had done. He wrote that he sat in his bunk for 3 nights after the screening and did not sleep. And he wrote that on the 4th night, in the dark, listening to the breathing of the other men in the barracks, he understood that the films were not fake. He understood it because he remembered things, small things. Rumors he had heard in the ranks in 1941. Conversations between older soldiers that had been cut off when they noticed a young recruit standing nearby. A cousin who had served in the East and had come home on leave with something behind his eyes that had not been there before. He had known, Heino wrote. Not all of it, not the scale, not the industrial machinery of it. But he had known enough to have suspected, and he had chosen, like millions of others, not to look at what he suspected. He wrote that the films did not make him a different man. They simply forced him to become the man he had been avoiding becoming. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The prisoners at Camp Hearn did not go home. This is the part of the story that most Americans, even many who know a little about the prisoner of war camps, have never been told. The American government did not release its 425,000 German prisoners on the day the guns fell silent and shipped them across the Atlantic in the summer that followed. It could not. There were not enough ships. There was not enough food in the ruined cities where the prisoners' families were living to receive them. And there was above all a labor problem in Europe, an enormous, urgent labor problem. Millions of buildings had to be cleared. Millions of acres had to be planted. Roads, bridges, railway lines, coal mines. The Allies had, at their disposal, a solution to that problem that was already assembled, already fed, already documented in triplicate. And so, in the last months of 1945, and through most of 1946, the German prisoners at Camp Hearn and every camp like it were shipped back across the Atlantic in slow, careful convoys. But many of them were not sent home. They were transferred at the docks in France and in England to the custody of the British and French governments. And they were put to work. They cleared rubble in bombed cities. They dug in French coal mines. They rebuilt roads and bridges. They planted crops in fields that had gone unworked for years. Some of them in French captivity were treated harshly on rations that were far below what they had eaten in Texas. Some of them died, most of them, eventually. In 1947 or 1948 were released. Heino Eriksson was among them. He was transferred first to Kentucky, then across the Atlantic, then into a French labor camp where the calories were low and the winters were long, and the memory of a Texas mess hall began to seem, in the way that memories do, like something out of another life. He wrote later that those months were the hardest of his life, harder than North Africa, harder even than the first weeks at Camp Hearn, when he had been a starving 18-year-old, alone on the wrong side of an ocean. He thought often, during those French months, of a cup of cold water handed to him in a cotton field on a summer morning in 1943. He reached his family in Germany at last. They did not fully recognize him. He had been a boy when he was captured. He came back a man, thinner than he had been in Texas, with lines in his face that had not been there before. The country he returned to was in ruins. Half the buildings he remembered were gone. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble by British and American bombers and had not yet been cleared. The bread was rationed. The coffee, when there was coffee at all, was made from ground acorns. Heino Eriksson tried to describe to his family what the last 4 years of his life had been. He wrote later that he did not know how to describe it. He wrote that the words did not exist in either language for what he had seen and understood and become. The story of the German prisoners in America might have ended there, in the ruined kitchens of post-war Germany, as a private memory carried by 400,000 men and slowly forgotten by everyone else. It did not end there. In the years that followed the war, something remarkable began to happen. Former prisoners who had been held in American camps began, in small and then in larger numbers, to write letters back to the farmers and the guards and the small-town shopkeepers they had known during their captivity. They asked for news. They sent photographs of their children. They described, in the careful German of men who had learned to write their own language properly again after years of soldiers' slang, what their lives were becoming in the slow recovery of the Federal Republic. Some of the Americans wrote back, and in the 1950s, some of the former prisoners began, one at a time, and then in small groups, to come back. They came back as tourists. They came back as immigrants. They came back to the small Texas towns and the Oklahoma wheat country and the Louisiana pine forests where they had spent the strangest years of their lives. And they walked the roads outside the fences that were no longer standing. They knocked on the doors of the farmhouses where they had once worked. And in more than a few cases, they were invited in for coffee by the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the men and women who had leased their labor from the United States Army for 80 cents a day. Some of them stayed. Heino Erickson was one of the ones who came back to stay. He arrived in the United States in 1953. He settled in Texas. He met a young woman from Minnesota named Jean Nelson. She had grown up during the Depression. She had watched the Second World War through newsreels, sitting in dark theaters in the upper Midwest, listening to the voice of the announcer tell her that men like Heino Erickson were the enemy. They fell in love. They married. In 1958, Heino Erickson became a citizen of the United States of America. He and John spent the rest of their working lives helping children who had been orphaned by war and poverty in Latin America and Asia find homes with American families. Jean would eventually be inducted into the National Council for Adoption Hall of Fame. They traveled the world together doing that work, and they raised their own family in Texas. Heino Erickson made his life in the country that had once held him behind wire. Somewhere in Germany, in those same years, a man named Günther Meisel, who had been convicted of the murder of Hugo Kraus, was living out his own post-war life. He had confessed, before the camp closed in 1946, to what he had done in the barracks that December night in 1943. He had said, according to the record, that he was sorry that he could not carry it any longer. The awakening had come, in the end, not only to the boys who had been misled. It had come, in some cases, to the men who had done the misleading. The 5 men convicted of the Kraus killing had all been released by the American government in 1949 and sent home to Germany. Some of them, in the decades that followed, would give interviews. Some of them would maintain their silence. Hugo Kraus stayed 24 years old. He remained buried in the country he had loved and returned to and lost. His parents in New York outlived him. His American accent, which had killed him, was carried by no one else. In the year 2001, when he was in his late 70s, Heino Erickson did 2 things that made sure the story of Camp Hearn would not disappear with the last of the men who had lived it. Published his memoir. He called it The Reluctant Warrior. Former German POW finds peace in Texas. It was a small book in a small edition brought out by a small press in Austin. It was read mostly by other former prisoners and by their families and by the handful of American historians who had devoted their careers to this quiet corner of the war. And in that same year, in the town of Hearn, Texas, a small museum finally opened its doors. Local historians had spent years gathering artifacts, interviewing surviving guards and townspeople, tracking down former prisoners in Germany and inviting them to send letters, photographs, small objects from the camp days. The museum stood not far from the ground where the barracks had once been. Heino Erickson was there, an old man in a jacket that hung a little loose on his shoulders. He walked among the display cases and the salvaged pieces of barbed wire and the photographs of young men in gray fatigues, and he wept without embarrassment in front of strangers who did not know him, but who understood, in some way, why he was weeping. He walked out onto the land where the barracks had once stood. There was nothing there. The fences were long gone. The buildings had been sold for lumber and hauled away in 1960 946. The cotton fields where he had bled into his sack in the summer of 1943 had been converted to pasture, and then, in more recent years, to subdivisions and highways. The Texas that had held him prisoner had been paved over and rebuilt many times. But the flat land was the same flat land. The sky was the same sky. And Heino Eriksson, standing in the tall grass of a summer afternoon in 2001, understood something about his own life that he had been trying to understand for 58 years. More than 425,000 German prisoners were held in the United States during the Second World War. There is no other example in the history of modern warfare of a captor nation holding that many enemy combatants with that little trouble. The historians who have studied the American prisoner of war program have offered many explanations for that record. The distances involved, the isolation of the camps, the impossibility of escape across an ocean. All of that is true. But the more honest historians, the ones who have read the letters and the memoirs and the post-war surveys, have come to a simpler conclusion. The prisoners did not try to escape because they had no reason to. They were fed, they were housed, they were paid in a small way for their work. They were treated, most of the time, with the routine, unremarkable decency that a well-run bureaucracy is capable of extending even to its enemies. And a significant number of them, by the end of their captivity, had come to understand the country holding them in a way that changed what they believed about the world for the rest of their lives. It was not a perfect story. It was not, as the death of Hugo Kraus made permanently clear, a gentle story. It was not, as the young black soldier standing on the sidewalk in Herne made permanently clear, a story America could tell about itself without also telling harder stories. But it was, in its way, an American story. A story about what a country can do in the middle of the worst war in human history, when it decides that the rules apply even to the people it is trying to defeat. A story about what happens over years and across an ocean when hungry young men are fed and frightened young men are left alone, and ordinary decency is allowed to do its slow, patient work. Heino Eriksson died in Texas in 2013, an old man in a country he had first entered as a prisoner and had chosen, in the end, to call home. He is buried in the state that once held him behind wire. His memoir sits on the shelves of a small museum in Herne, alongside the salvaged pieces of that wire and the mess trays and the photographs of the young men in gray fatigues. He wrote in the last pages of that memoir that he had come to believe there were two Germanys and two Americas alive inside the wire of Camp Herne in the years of his captivity. He wrote that the war, in the end, had been fought not only between the countries but inside them, and that the outcome that mattered most was not the one decided by the tanks and the bombers, but the one decided in the slow, private choices that men made about what kind of people they were going to be. He wrote that he had made his choice, in the end, in a mess hall in Texas, watching a film he did not want to believe. He wrote that he was grateful for the rest of his life that the choice had been offered to him. And he wrote that when he thought of America in his old age, he did not think first of the flag or of the guns or of the great gray convoys stretching to the horizon in the middle of the Atlantic. He thought of a cup of water offered by a stranger on a summer afternoon, in a language his grandfather would have understood.